speaker. This year's series is on ocean acidification, and it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Terry at the School of Marine Affairs to introduce this week's speaker.
Thanks, Trevor. My voice isn't quite so loud. Can you guys hear me? Is it picking up? So, for those that don't know me, I'm Terry Klinger from the new School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. And I'm here, I'm really glad to introduce Scott Doney to you. Although Scott is known to many of you in the audience already, I'll put out just a few highlights. This is really his full CV, and Trevor told me it was too long to read to you.
Saves me some time.
So, Scott comes to us from Woods Hole, and most of you know that. At Woods Hole, he is the senior scientist in the Department of Marine Chemistry and Geochemistry, and he is a PI in the Computational Biogeochemistry group. There, his work focuses on marine ecosystem dynamics and the role of the ocean in the global carbon cycle. So his work is much broader than ocean acidification, but ocean acidification is a very prominent aspect of his work. Also, Woods Hole, he teaches courses and he advises students. Prior to coming to or arriving at Woods Hole for this position, Scott served for 11 years at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Before that, he obtained his PhD in the joint program, the joint MIT program at Woods Hole. Before that, he really is ultimately a West Coast boy. He comes to us really from UCSB, where he did his undergraduate work, and before that, California. As you might imagine, Scott served on a large number of external committees and boards. I won't read them all to you, but there are a few that are notable, especially in the context of his visit here. He is the inaugural chair of the Ocean Carbon Biogeochemistry Program that's jointly sponsored by NASA, NOAA, and NASA, NOAA, and NSF. He served on at least 2 National Research Council committees. He's a fellow of the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program and is a fellow of the HU. Incredibly, he has published more than 160 scientific papers, and Trevor pointed out that was just last year alone. And he's also written for the general public, and as well as advising Congress. As many of you probably know, Scott has been nominated by President Obama to serve as the chief scientist for NOAA, and that nomination is awaiting confirmation. Despite that, that's not the reason we asked him to speak today. We asked him to speak about ocean acidification effects. And that is on the basis
I was asked to talk about one aspect of ocean acidification, which is some of the economic and perhaps some of the social aspects of the potential impacts of ocean acidification. And I should just caveat that my background is primarily as a natural scientist. And a lot of the work I'm going to show is actually a collaborative effort between myself and a number of people, both at Woods Hole and in the broader community. In particular, I want to highlight Sarah Cooley, who's on the technical staff at WUI, Hauke Powell, who's at the Marine Policy Center, and Noelle Lucy, who's a graduate student at the University of Miami. We've been working together. A lot of the results I'll hopefully be able to get to at the end of the talk, where we dig into a little bit deeper some of the global production numbers for some species that are sensitive to ocean acidification really have come out of that joint collaboration. So I know a number of you have been at previous talks, but some of you may not have been at all the ocean acidification talks in the series. So I wanted to give a brief background on some of the chemistry and some of the biological effects that have been reported in the literature. So I'm showing here in this panel, the top, this red line is actually the atmospheric CO2 record from Mauna Loa. This is part of the Dave Keeling curve that's now been taken over and collected by NOAA. And what you see is, as most people are aware of, is rising atmospheric CO2 that's linked to fossil fuel combustion and also deforestation, now primarily in the tropics. Below that in blue is the record from the Hawaii Ocean Time Series, of the surface partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And what you see over decadal timescales is the rising atmospheric CO2 is matched by a corresponding rise in this carbon dioxide partial pressure in the surface ocean. Basically, carbon dioxide is invading into the surface ocean and is in a quasi-steady state with an offset to the atmosphere. As the CO2 gets into the ocean, it's changing a whole suite of chemical changes. Ocean acidification is probably a bit of a misnomer because it's actually a collection of different changes, including rising partial pressure of carbon dioxide, rising amount of hydrogen ion, and thus decreasing pH. But importantly, for many of the biological effects, a decrease in the carbonate ion concentration. And for pure chemical equilibrium, for say a calcium carbonate shell, think of chalk or a clam shell, if you were just to take a pure piece of calcium carbonate and put it in water, you can actually establish a thermodynamic equilibrium where if the carbonate ion concentration drops too low, the shell will actually start to dissolve. And so a lot of the work is expressed in terms of the saturation state of carbonate minerals. It's different for different mineral forms, but it's usually given in a form such as this, where this omega value is the saturation state. When it's greater than 1, the water is actually supersaturated with respect to calcium carbonate. When it's less than 1, it's undersaturated. And under undersaturated conditions, you expect the shell to start to dissolve. One of the quotes I really like is, if you go back to the very beginning of the atmospheric CO2 record in the late 1950s, when Dave Keeling was starting this in 57, 58, about the same time, Roger Revelle and Hans Suess wrote a paper looking at the question of what's going to happen to fossil fuel CO2. And in that paper they write, thus human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment. By burning fossil fuels, we're going to have a fundamental effect on the entire geochemical cycle of carbon and also climate. What I think you could now add to that is that we're having a similar effect on seawater chemistry because such a large fraction, something like about a quarter, of all the fossil fuel emissions are ending up in the ocean. And they're having large-scale changes on surface water chemistry, and those chemical changes are propagating into the interior. In terms of biological effects, a lot of the emphasis so far has been on these shell-forming organisms, things that corals, mollusks, various echinoderms. And what's been seen for a lot of shell-forming both plants and animals is that under more acidic conditions, under elevated CO2, you see reduced shell formation. Often you see increased mortality, reduced growth rates, reduced reproduction rates, and in extreme cases, malformed shells or malformed skeletons. In addition, many of these shell-forming species form critical habitats. Obviously, tropical and deep-water corals are obvious regions that could be affected that would then propagate to a whole variety of other species and basically that underpin these corals, underpin an entire ecosystem. Similarly, for some coastal regions where you get oyster reefs, you could see large-scale changes in the structure of the habitat. What's been less explored so far, but there are people working on it, is what's other implications in terms of food webs. If you have a reduction in some of these shell-forming plants and animals, how is that going to feed into and impact their predators? So we're one of the major predators, but also fish, marine mammals. There's very intriguing work, and you'll hear some more, I think, next week, on direct effects on finfish, but the ecosystem level, community level implications of that aren't as well detailed. And there's also a fair amount of work for some types of algae and also seagrasses that suggest under elevated CO2 you could actually see benefits to those species. A lot of algae do better, seagrasses do better, increased photosynthesis rates, increased production. So it's not entirely a negative story. What it really is a story of shifts in community structure, a reduction in calcifying organisms, and increase in non-calcifying organisms. I want to talk a little bit very quickly about some of the mollusks, because that's going to be the focus of the talk. There has been work on crustaceans, but the crustaceans story isn't as well developed, I think, as mollusks. And for some crustaceans, you see conflicting results where you have both increased and decreased calcification rates depending upon CO2 level. And I think that needs to be explored a little more. A lot of our work has been focused, therefore, on the mollusks, where there appears to be a fairly consistent story of higher CO2 leading to reduced calcification rates and reduced growth rates. This is some of the earlier work from Guzzo et al. Showing as you move to higher CO2 levels, reduced calcification rates for a mussel in the top panel and an oyster. Similar studies have now been done for a number of different bay scallops, clams. This has been replicated in a variety of different systems. And what they see is a fairly consistent story of reduced calcification, increased mortality, particularly at the juvenile stages, and in some cases, reduced settlement of the juveniles, leading to reduced recruitment. This is another recent study. This is from Goldberg and Talmage. I hope I pronounced that right. This is looking at mortality rates for a hard clam and a scallop against various CO2 concentrations. The blue line is basically at the same spot in every graph, and what you see is very interesting. They compared sort of pre-industrial CO2 levels, about 250. This is a little below pre-industrial. Something like modern, something like maybe the end of this century, and then something well into the next century. What I found interesting about this result is that they're actually seeing increase in mortality. So this is actually a decrease in survival rate or increased mortality, even for present-day conditions, which suggests that acidification isn't something, a problem for the future, 2, 3, 4 decades out, but really maybe already occurring, that the natural state that we're seeing now may already be perturbed because of past increase in atmospheric CO2. This is a study by Miller et al. Looking at 2 oyster species that are native to or have been introduced in aquaculture into the Chesapeake Bay. One of the things that we'll talk about later when we come to aquaculture is, are there opportunities for looking at differential species responses? So the eastern oyster tended to have a stronger response to decreasing calcification with increasing CO2 than a Pacific import. And so one of the suggestions is that perhaps as we move forward and are trying to adapt to rising CO2, one opportunity might be species replacement, switching to species that are less sensitive. This hasn't been done in a full suite of species, but it's clearly one of the things that needs to be done. I stole one of Dick's slides. Dick stole a lot of my slides, so it's only fair. So this is a slide that Dick Feely showed at the first lecture, suggesting that what are some of the other potential food web effects beyond just the direct effects on particular organisms. So a number of species in the North Pacific, coccolithophores, copepods, pteropods, are all important prey species for higher trophic levels. So, for example, Pacific salmon. All of these species are calcium carbonate forming species and may be sensitive to rising CO2. What we don't know is, let's say if there were a drop in either the coccolithophore concentration or biomass, or a drop in the pteropod biomass, how is that going to feed up into salmon? Would they be able to switch to other prey species, or would they experience a decline in recruitment because of a drop in specific prey species? So that's kind of a quick overview. I know there'll be a number of more detailed lectures in this series on chemical and biological effects, but I wanted to sort of set the stage a little bit. Now I want to switch gears and start looking at the problem from more of a socioeconomic point of view. And given that this is the Bevan series of sustainable fisheries, I wanted to go back and sort of think about, well, what do we mean by sustainability? One of the things, one way of thinking of the ocean is it's a sustainable resource that provides benefits to humans through a variety of ecosystem services. The problem, of course, is that there's a variety of human activities that are degrading the ocean and may endanger or reduce many of the ecosystem services. And one of the papers that came out recently that I really liked was an NC study put together by Halpern et al., where they tried to at least quantify the geographical distribution of some of these degrading factors. So they looked at 17 different metrics. Some of the key ones were climate change, fishing, pollution, and acidification. And they tried to map out hotspots. Now this is a preliminary effort, but you can obviously see the imprint of fishing in terms of the North Sea, off the east coast of Asia. But the impacts extend much beyond those regions. In fact, when you look at acidification effects, climate, and even pollution, they really are global factors. And so we're seeing degradation not just of the nearshore region, but of the open ocean on a large-scale global system. Now, one of the things that has been coming out of a lot of research, and I've drawn here from an NC's working group on ocean ecosystem health that a number of us are involved in, is trying to think about not just the natural response, but how this feeds up to ecosystem services, and then how people are actually going to respond to that. So you can think of these human drivers or pressures as affecting ecosystem conditions, things like biomass rates, biomass productivity rates, community composition. It's also going to be modulated by environmental variability, which can both exacerbate human-driven pressures, but also complicate the analysis and identification and attribution of human-driven effects. From those ecosystem conditions, you really derive the ecosystem services, things that we benefit from, that then feeds back into human well-being. The big wild card in this are actually humans themselves. How are people going to respond to changes in the amount of fish standing stock, geographical ranges? This can be at the level of individual decision makers, sort of in a free agent market environment where individual people are going to vote with their feet. It can be at the national and international level, state level, through various government and management decisions. But I think one of the things that we want to start thinking about in ocean acidification is the stakeholders who are involved, how they're going to respond when they see, for example, a drop in harvest rates. Are they going to be able to develop adaptive strategies? Are they going to move, shift to a different industry within a fishery, or are they going to have to move out of the fishery altogether? And so I won't be able to put a lot of numbers or dynamics yet on this, but this is certainly the direction I think we need to go, which is not just thinking about this link of human perturbation, changing ecosystem condition, but how this feeds all the way through and what the feedbacks are between the social systems and the natural systems. As part of this NC's effort, we've been trying to put together sort of a broad view of ecosystem health. You know, you can think of a variety of different ways of slicing up the pie and different values we get from the ocean, everything from sustaining iconic species, put polar bear, penguin, whatever you want on there, all the way down to climate regulation. Today I'm mostly going to focus on fisheries and some of the more economic value that comes from fisheries. So things like sustaining coastal and marine livelihoods, providing wealth, also providing food and sustenance options, and then also because of the important role of recreational fishing, the role of recreation, and perhaps I'll get to in tourism. One of the challenges, I admit I'm not an economist, so I'm coming at this from the outside. There's a lot of challenges in attempting to put economic value to these ecosystem services. And if you think about, you can kind of think of an ecological benefit. One benefit type is non-use. The existence of polar bears in the Arctic, I get some value from that. But I'm not actually going there. I'm not actually using that ecosystem versus, the more standard use, which would be harvest or actually participating, recreation in a system. There's direct and indirect effects. And then for the direct effects, there's market values, or market values and non-market values. As you move down this chain, things over here, things that have a market value, things like fishery catches that we can actually quantify, how much revenue is being generated by those, are relatively easy to quantify and put a dollar value on. It's much more difficult as you move back up this chain to non-market values, indirect, and non-use. There are techniques, I won't go through them in detail, and I'll try to focus mostly over here on fisheries and market values, but I think if you want to look at the broad, overarching effects, economic effects of ocean acidification, we're going to have to start dealing with some of these other factors, and they do become a little bit more nebulous, and you can get into maybe some discussion of the reception on those. So one of the things that Sarah Cooley, who was a postdoc in my group and is now on the technical staff at COOE, one of the projects she took on was to try to do some analysis of the existing published fishery data to really look at what the potential sensitivity or susceptibility from an economic perspective is to ocean acidification. And I should say a lot of this work really is a baseline scoping to kind of give an assessment for the potential size of the problem, and we're now starting to dig into more detail. But she started by looking at the U.S. fishery data, and we started by looking at the primary revenues. Basically, how much when a fisher comes to the dock with his catch, how much is he being paid for that catch? In part, this is a very important element of the overall economics of fisheries, and it's also a relatively accessible market value, so it was a good place to start. One of the interesting things, if you look at the U.S. revenues, ex-vessel or primary revenues, it comes to about $4 billion US per year. About half of that value is coming either from mollusks or from crustaceans. And then another quarter or so are things that feed directly on our finfish that feed either directly on mollusks or crustaceans. So at least from broad brush, without having enough detailed biological data yet for each of these species, you would at least say, based on the early laboratory data, that a fairly substantial chunk of the U.S. fishery could be susceptible to changing ocean acidification. Now, that is distributed regionally. So, for example, I come from New England, and the New England fishery is predominantly a mollusk and a crustacean. Fishery. Where if you were to look at the Alaska fishery, in contrast, it's primarily a finfish with a smaller crustacean. Potentially the Alaska fishery could be sensitive because of these food web effects, as I mentioned earlier, with impacts on, say, krill, copepods, pteropods. But in terms of direct effects, we're probably looking at New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Gulf as being the places that are most susceptible directly. Now, these primary revenues drive a whole host of secondary effects in terms of wholesaling, processing of seafood, commercial sales of seafood, and eventually retail sales. Some of the numbers, and depending on different systems, suggest that the fishery revenues, if you take the primary revenues, generate secondary effects that are, say, double to quadruple the original value. So in terms of regional economic effects, $1 in fishery revenues might generate $4 in the regional economy. But that does depend a little bit on how you do the accounting and varies from region to region. The other thing is that the U.S. fishery, the U.S. seafood industry, actually we import most of our seafood. The majority of our seafood is imported. But we're also importing a lot of the same species which are sensitive which is potentially sensitive or susceptible to ocean acidification. And when you look at the overall seafood industry, depending on whose numbers you choose to look at, it's something like on the order of $70 to $100 billion industry, and adds something like $35 to $45 billion to our gross national product. So we could have effects both through direct effects at the fishing level of catch within U.S. waters, but also if we're not able to import a lot of these species in seafood, that would have additional ripple-on effects, economic effects. Now, revenues are only one side of the story. If you really want to get into the economics, you really want to sort of look at both costs and benefits. And so cost-benefit analysis is sort of the traditional economic approach where you would really want to look at the net benefits, which is the total revenue minus the total cost. Getting at the costs for individual fisheries is a little bit more difficult. It isn't documented in many cases for a lot of fisheries, but I think it's really a key research, socioeconomic research area. Because in the end, from a societal point of view, we really do want to be looking at the net benefits. A lot of fisheries, particularly if they're not regulated well, this is true particularly for a lot of foreign fisheries, which are not regulated well, tend to have about a zero net benefit. The fishery expands until the costs approximately balance the benefits. Which would suggest that particularly as ocean acidification, if it were to grow and reduce revenues because it reduces productions, would suggest that you really want to start to reallocate that capital and labor. You have an opportunity cost of investing labor and capital into a fishery, and if you're not getting any net benefit from society, the best thing from an economic point of view is actually to move that labor and capital into either into other fisheries or remove it from the fishery altogether. That's politically often very difficult. It's socially often very difficult. People don't want to hear that. A lot of fishing communities are in rural areas. It's often there's a low mobility and be able to retrain those communities into other industries. But it's something from a cost benefit, from a purely economic point of view, ignoring the politics and the social dynamics. That's the direction you want to go. But as I say, it doesn't actually always happen in practice. One of the other issues with ocean acidification, when you start to think about it from an economic point of view, is it has a fairly long time horizon. Some of the smallest results, although there's some suggestions, and I'll show it a little bit later, that we might already be seeing declines in production due to ocean acidification, or at least acidified waters. Many of the model projections are saying this is something 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out. Well, when you start to look at those time horizons, in order to do a cost-benefit analysis, we really need to know something about how prices are going to vary with time, which says we need to know something about the global food market, because seafood is just one component of the global food market. Seafood prices and seafood costs are going to be associated with changes in the supply and demand of food. So we need to look at it in a broader context of not just the global fisheries, but global agriculture as a whole and the demands for protein across terrestrial and marine systems. I won't go into too much detail, but typically in economic analysis, things that happen in the future, we discount the value of. There's a variety of different ways of thinking about this. One is simply that $1 today is worth more than $1 10 years from now, because I could always invest my $1 now and have a return on that investment, and it's going to be hopefully worth more than $1. Now, I say that, but my retirement fund keeps going down, so maybe that investment model doesn't work well. But it is true in a lot of standard economic analysis, and there's certainly been a lot of debate within the climate change community. What is the right discounting rate for looking at future benefits or future losses? And that's another thing we can sit and talk about at the reception. There are economic arguments, there are philosophical and ethical arguments over discounting, but it needs to be considered and brought into play in any type of economic analysis, particularly for a long time horizon. The other thing is basically decision making, whether it's decision making at the level of an individual fisher, a company, a seafood processing company, or governance. The time frame that those decisions are made is typically much shorter than this decadal time scale for ocean acidification. So if you go to a fisheries manager and say, well, ocean acidification is coming, their answer is, that's great, but I need to make decisions right now in terms of what my catch limits are for next year. Or if you go to a seafood company, they're talking about issues of capitalization. Do I buy a new boat? Do I build a new seafood processing plant? Do I open a hatchery? And the timescales for that are typically, there's a bit of a mismatch often, particularly for capitalization, because they're trying to see return on their investment on a shorter time frame than the multi-decadal. For some of the hatcheries, it may be true that we can start to see that the time frame for that capitalization is on the same scale that we may start to see acidification effects. The other thing is that a lot of these economic effects, we tend to aggregate at the global level or the national level, but the reality is they're going to be very locally concentrated. And typically a lot of these fishing communities are they're often relatively isolated, either geographically or socially from surrounding communities. And so even though on an aggregated national level you might say, well, a $70 billion industry in a 14, our global national product is $14 trillion, it seems like a relatively small component. But looking on a local scale, you can see potentially very devastating effects to local communities. And I picked one here which is literally close to my home, which is New Bedford, Mass, which is right across Pleasant Bay. New Bedford, Mass is, in terms of the values of fish landings, is the single largest port in the U.S. And it's primarily from the sea scallop fishery. In the last time I grabbed data was 2007. The 2007 data was about a $270 million per year primary revenue. And New Bedford it's a classic post-industrial, post-manufacturing town that depends very heavily on revenue from the fishing industry. And it's already a region of high unemployment, high poverty levels. And so impacts to the fishery could really propagate quite rapidly through that region. So we need to think not just at large aggregation levels, but at the local level of specific communities. There can be, in addition to standard commercial wild harvest fisheries, these are just some numbers, and I won't go through the details. These are some analysis that we did from Massachusetts in terms of aquaculture, particularly mollusks, things like recreational fin fishing, which brings in quite a bit of income, both to the local economy, but it's also bringing people in from outside the state, so it's actually a net revenue gain for the state. And then also recreational shellfishing, I've sort of narrowed down here closer and closer to home, looking at Cape Cod. All of these have net economic value to the communities, and you need to think about it at multiple levels of organization. Now we can start to look at some analogs that might give us some idea of what the effects of ocean acidification might be economically. And I should say there's sort of two scales to this. There's I already have a fishery in place, I've capitalized, I have people, a labor force that's trained and working in this area. So you have what you might call an acute response, which is you have some reduction in standing stock or fish catch or harvest, and that's going to have an immediate economic impact on those fishing communities. Over time, as an adaptive human system, if this happens year after year that you have reduced production, those people will move out. They will vote with their feet, they will adapt, they will decapitalize the fishery, and they will get retraining, and they will move out of the industry. So the acute response is the strongest, most immediate, largest response, and then over time, that will be mitigated by shifts in the labor pool and shifts in capitalization. So this is sort of the most extreme. If ocean acidification were to turn on everywhere tomorrow, these are sort of the kind of economic effects we would see. Some of the analogs that I'm going to show are harmful algal blooms. So this is a very big bloom happened in New England in 2005, and essentially almost the entire Gulf of Maine and Cape Cod were closed to shellfishing during part of the year. These blue arrows, these are some estimates of how much the reduction in landings that occurred because of these closures. So there were still, the standing stock was still there, it just couldn't be harvested because of the harmful algal bloom. But in some ways, from a fisher perspective, it would be like there was a reduced standing stock, reduced harvest. Oh, I should say one of the issues with this kind of analysis is you have to kind of figure out what would the harvest have been that year, because there's year-to-year variability in the harvest. So this analysis tried to factor in other environmental factors. Was it going to be a good year, or was it going to be a bad year in terms of harvest? To put some numbers on this, this is some work from Jin et al. They estimated that about $2.5 million in loss in Maine due to the soft-shell clam, reduction in soft-shell clam landings. And in Massachusetts, something less than up to $18 million loss in mussel landings. This wasn't the entire range, but this was the species that they were able to analyze. Now, one of the interesting things is that there was compensation in the system. If you have reduced landings locally, this was compensated by increased imports from other regions. So, for example, they were able to document that these closures led to increased inflow of shellfish from New York, and that the fish market prices for these items actually went up in New York because of the increased import demands. Now, this could be expanded to the state, regional, and global level, that if we have localized effects of ocean acidification, there might be some compensation by increases or changes in trade patterns. But if you have a large-scale effect, obviously trade isn't going to get you out of this. But this did, at least for the economic impacts for secondary processing, retail sales, commercial sales, did have some compensation for these direct revenues. Another study, harmful algal bloom study, was done by Dyson and Cooper, looking more closely home here at the recreational razor clam fishery off of Washington. And they suggested that this industry generates roughly 400 jobs and brings about $12 million in labor income to 2 counties, rural counties on the coast. And that if you were to have a year-long closure, almost all of those jobs and this labor income would go away. So this sort of gives a scale for the potential of impact if you were to lose this fishery for a short period, or for a 1-year period. I should say, before I go into that, the recreational, unlike commercial fisheries where you would expect to see a reallocation, recreational fisheries, often this is something that people have a personal value in, and even if the fishery were to decline, they still might have a perceived value, even though the fishery might have disappeared a long time ago. And that's until there's changes in the social norms of what people put their utility or value in terms of recreational fishing. One more example, which I think has been brought up in some of the previous talks, is the Northwest Shellfish industry. These are some numbers I got from Alan Barton and the North Pacific Shellfish Growers Association. Between the Pacific Northwest, where there's been commercial harvesting for about 1.5 centuries, and if you look out across the whole region that the North Pacific shellfish growers deal with, which is Washington, Oregon, California, Alaska, and Hawaii, it's something like about $110 million farm gate, so that's equivalent to the primary revenues for a capture fishery, bringing something like about $300 million to the rural coastal communities and about 3,000 jobs. So this is a fairly substantial industry, particularly along the coast and in Puget Sound. And as I think Dick went through in his lecture, there's been a fairly dramatic reduction in the hatchery production that's been linked to decreases in pH in the source waters that they're using in the hatchery. And there's been a variety of different adaptation strategies considered. One would be to actually modify the chemistry of the water before it came into the hatchery. That they've tried, it's had some success, but not completely. The current strategy is basically monitor the seawater chemistry offshore, or in the coastal waters, and then basically pick your moment. So you're basically using monitoring to provide information, and then you focus production in periods where the water environmental conditions are good. Now, this is assuming that there's enough variability where there are good environmental conditions. And as I mentioned earlier, one possibility is to switch the species that you're culturing because the effects they've seen are primarily isolated to a single species. This may be the desired strategy on a long-term basis, particularly if the environmental variability, if the system continues to shift such that there aren't good moments, there are no longer good environmental conditions in this variability cycle. So I'm going to switch gears and now move into some more global perspective. I would say that we have less information at the global level on a lot of the economic valuations. Often the numbers aren't as good when you're trying to do country-by-country basis. There are some analyses that have been done, but I'm mostly going to talk a little more about total landings as a proxy for economic value. Many of you have probably seen curves similar to this. This is the global fishery aggregated together, where red is marine capture. So these are wild harvest capture. Orange is marine aquaculture. Yellow is inland aquaculture, and green is inland capture. What you see is that the overall global fishery has been going up, driven by increasing population and also a rise in economic levels, leading to what you might call an increased protein demand. So there's a bigger human population with time, but also those people want a more protein-rich diet. And seafood is an obvious place that they've been attempting to meet that protein demand. The other trend that you see in this is that the global marine capture fisheries have essentially plateaued. And so the increase that we've seen over the last 20 years in the global fishery really has been driven mostly by a combination of marine and inland freshwater aquaculture. Here are just some numbers just to give you a scale for the capture fishery is about 90 billion. Aquaculture is about, in terms of value, is closing in on the capture fishery at about 80 billion. One of the interesting things is that this aquaculture, a lot of both the marine and freshwater aquaculture, it's primarily Asian market, and about half of the total value in aquaculture is coming from China. So, as with many other things in the 21st century, if we're thinking about large-scale changes in global fisheries, China plays a pivotal role, both from the capture fishery side, but particularly in the aquaculture side. Just as I showed earlier, there's a lot of regional variations. I think my color bar is a little off here, but regional variations in the role of different species that might be susceptible to ocean acidification. So again, the reds were the mollusks, yellows were crustaceans. The Southern Ocean is on a different scale, so this is actually the krill fishery, but it's much smaller than the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean fisheries. We've been attempting to look specifically, drill down into these red bars, look at the mollusk fishery. This is just to give you an idea of where the major sources of production are. This is on a per-person basis by country level, and everywhere that's dark, it doesn't come out that great on this particular projector, are regions that have large production. So of either aquaculture or wild capture mollusks. So US, Canada, parts of Europe, and a lot of Asia, parts of Chile, etc. Just to sort of give you some idea of some temporal trends, this gray bar here is the wild harvest of mollusks. So this is scallops, things like this. This is for the Northwest Atlantic. The harvest has remained about constant over time, but what you've seen is a large-scale reduction in finfish harvest. So although in this region the overall level of capture for mollusks has remained about constant, its proportion and contribution to the overall fishery in this region has actually gone up as you've seen a decline, particularly in the demersal marine fish. In terms of aquaculture, the gray again is the mollusks, and you see this ever-growing aquaculture, which now greatly exceeds the wild capture. So if you're thinking about mollusks, it's primarily an aquaculture story, other than, for example, the sea scallops, which I showed earlier from the Bedford. This is a lot of this is sea scallops. We've tried to look a little bit at how this fits into other economic indicators. So things like shellfish export, what's the contribution to countries' gross domestic product? Again, darker is bigger. Which countries depend upon shellfish and mollusks for their protein source? Where are we seeing primarily the largest sources of aquaculture? So I mentioned China being a very big player in that, but also parts of Europe and other countries within Asia. And then interestingly, where are we sending, what countries are importing mollusks? And where is there a protein gap? So a lot of the tropical countries where you have very poor nutrition, and if you were to think about what role aquaculture can play in terms of solving other social problems like malnutrition, these countries that are in dark are the ones where you might think about that as a possible strategy for increasing protein supply to developing world fisheries. This is a lot of things to look at the same time. One of the things that we've been trying to do is really try to aggregate this into a vulnerability index, trying to balance out who's most dependent on mollusks, where might they be most sensitive to ocean acidification. So we've looked at things like exposure, looking at regional changes in chemistry, and what countries might be most susceptible soonest to ocean acidification. Sensitivity in terms of the size of the mollusk fishery, how much seafood they import, how dependent upon are they for imports, for food supply, what's basically their protein supply. Do they have ample protein, or are they really at the edge of how much protein they're getting? Coral reefs, tourism. And then we also, in here, sensitivity, we folded in the economic effects in terms of some countries may not be eating a lot of the mollusks, the shellfish, but they might be exporting them and generating hard currency that they then can use to import other commodities. And then finally, we folded in adaptive capacity. A country that has a high education level, a high income level, other industries might be able to adapt much easier to a reduction in shellfish harvest than one this is one of their major products, and it's one of the few things they can do, and they don't have the capital and governance structure to be able to shift gears very quickly. So what we did is we combined all that data from the previous plots. The color code here is that countries that are in the yellows and oranges are net importers of shellfish. So the U.S. is a net importer, large parts of Africa, Japan, a lot of Europe. The blues are regions that are net exporters. So these might be countries that are using shellfish for economic benefit. China is both a net, has a large imports and exports, but right now it's currently a net exporter. Lots of exports coming from South Asia, and then parts of Africa, Chile, etc. And then we try to shade it by regions, whether they're vulnerable or not, combining all of these different indices. Now, I'll admit, these indices are imperfect. This was our first cut at this. But this was trying to highlight countries that we thought, for one reason or another, might be particularly susceptible or sensitive from either a social perspective or an economic perspective to ocean acidification. And primarily, the most sensitive countries are either are in the tropics, and they're either countries that are heavily dependent upon export for bringing in hard currency, or they're regions where you see substantial insecurity in the food supply and they're dependent upon imports of seafood and mollusks, and disruption of that could lead to food shortages and also to reductions in protein. I won't go through some of the other things, but I just wanted to sort of wrap up here and then take some questions with a summary and also some what I think are research needs. I hope I've been able to convince you that if ocean acidification proceeds as we think it will, and that there are substantial biological impacts to things like mollusks, crustaceans, and perhaps finfish, either directly or through food web effects, that there could be substantial economic consequences and social consequences. Within the U.S., this is probably primarily an issue of economy and jobs, but at the global level, this is really an issue of food supply and also trade and export. And food supply then quickly leads into national security issues of disruptions in food supply lead to instability. And a lot of the regions where I showed potential susceptibility are also regions that were concerned about instability in terms of political systems. We really don't know well the net benefits and possible losses. More research is needed. This is more of a biological, but also the social effects, targeting species that are important for commercial and recreational fisheries, looking specifically at aquaculture and the potential adaptation strategies that different aquaculture approaches could adapt. And then I didn't really get into recreation, tourism, ecosystem, and cultural services. These are also very important and economically maybe harder to value, but may have a larger economic impact than direct effects on fisheries. I think a lot of work needs to be done on what you might call a coupled human natural systems. Basically, what is the adaptive capability, not just of the organisms, but of the social and human systems to get around this. Some of this might be by changing fishing practices or aquacultural practices. Others would be by basically reorienting economic effort to avoid problems generated by ocean acidification. There's substantial information needs, natural and social sciences targeting key fisheries, thresholds and time frames. When might we expect to see the effects? Particularly, are there biological nonlinearities that could lead to real uncertainties on a short time frame of what harvests might be? I didn't go into much detail, but and there will be another talk, I think, later in this series. But acidification is only one of multiple human stresses on the marine environment, and we really need to think about this in the context of other stresses, like particularly climate change and overfishing. And then one of the very interesting questions is, as you're doing research, if you want to get research funded, one of the questions is, well, how useful is that information? How can we fold, what's the value of that information for decision makers? And how do you balance research programs, monitoring programs, in a way that provides the most value to decision makers, whether they're at the private level or at the governance and national levels? And then finally, I think we're not going to be able to answer all these questions as fast as we would like. And so we're going to end up having to make decisions on a quicker time frame, and perhaps we'll have all our scientific ducks in a row. And so we really need to start thinking about how this information feeds into making decisions under uncertainty. Because I think we're going to have to start making decisions about ocean acidification well before all these issues are resolved. So I ran a little bit over, but I'll stop and take questions. Yeah.
What is the perception of this information been by fishing communities and fishermen? Do they see it and want to transition to the earlier species? Or?
Well, certainly, and other people in the audience can talk is this as well. I mean, I've worked with some of the fishing communities on the East Coast. There's a lot of interest from the shellfish aquaculture community, both on the West Coast and the East Coast. They are concerned. They see what's happening to some of the hatcheries here in Washington, and that's really raised a red flag. Other communities really just are focused on other problems, and this really hasn't received a lot of airplay. So the sea scallop industry and a lot of the finfish are focused on what they see as more immediate problems. I think this is really an issue of, a lot of it has to do with perceived risk, and there's a lot of other perceived risks in those other fishing communities, and this one sort of seems off in the distant future. Oh, anybody but Dr. Field.
I was curious, what do you know about it in terms of national security? Do we live without seafood or not? Do humankind live without seafood?
Humankind live without seafood. Various numbers get tossed around about, something like 1.5 million out of a current population going towards 7 billion depend directly on seafood for protein. I've seen that number has a wide variation depending on who reports it. If you look at population trends, and particularly if you look at some of these demographic issues as you get to basically growing urbanization and rising income, every model I've seen suggests we're going to have an increasing protein demand. There's only so much you can do on land because if you think about the agricultural footprint of producing protein, particularly from livestock, it takes up a much bigger footprint than eating lower down on the trophic level. So if people demand more protein, which all the studies suggest that they will, I think we need to we have to depend a lot on seafood, and I think the only vehicle, given that wild capture harvest has been fairly flat, really is looking at aquaculture. I gave a talk a couple months ago, given a couple of talks down at the Naval War College, and I was surprised at how engaged the audience was, thinking about food supply in general. Maybe not focused on seafood in particular, but really the role that instability in food supply linked to instability in water, sea level rise, which is going to cause displacement, particularly in a lot of tropical systems, riverine systems, agricultural systems, such as the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and the Nile. And I see those as all linked: water supply, food supply, and possible migration. I think there is a lot of concern about this. It's not the factor that's going to change geopolitics, but it makes all other geopolitical problems more difficult. And it just makes them more challenging.
How will your new job at NOAA science this list?
Okay. My sponsors have told me I can't answer that.
Oh, okay.
That's why I'm here. I'm supposed to say, Scott cannot answer that question.
Yeah, sorry. I haven't taken the position. I haven't been confirmed in the position. No.
Good answer.
I was going to ask, you mentioned the kind of data collection requirements to move from, this gross revenue to net revenue and jobs, and, given the increase in jobs and all of this. So I was just wondering if you know of kind of national data collection initiatives to collect that on, economic information that we need.
I mean, certainly within the U.S., NOAA has a fairly vigorous social sciences effort already within the National Fisheries, and I can say this because this is not something I came up with, but NOAA is really interested in bridging this gap between natural sciences and social sciences. So I think in the U.S. it's doable. It's challenging in a lot of the developing world, which is I think where a lot of these issues are going. But I think, for example, Helga Kai-Powell, who's one of my colleagues on this, is doing a lot of work in Tanzania, doing case studies on aquaculture there. And so I think at the U.S. level, it's really a matter of collecting the data. Sorry, in the developing world, where we're at the stage of really doing good case studies that they could lead to improve improve data collection. Yeah.
So, CO2 makes a lot of problems, not only OA,
Yeah.
global warming also. So what can we do for reducing the CO2?
Well, I think there's a variety of strategies that have been put on the table. I mean, the obvious ones are increased use of renewable fuels. I mean, they're fairly obvious. Increased use of renewable fuels, increased efficiency, switching fuel sources, so trying to switch away from coal towards more of a methane-based economy, and then also carbon capture and sequestration. Most of the analyses that have been done suggest that a lot of the efficiency, sorry, my voice is going. A lot of the efficiency solutions are actually economic net benefit. So it's a matter of what are the incentives to induce increased efficiency use. Most of the analysis suggests there are net costs for some of these others switching to renewables. How you get to that, what the political solutions are, I'm not really going to comment on, but I think there is technology that's in the pipeline that could help substantially. One of the things that's talked a lot about is investing in basically more energy technologies. And this is across the board, both in terms of things like carbon capture, but also renewable fuels. And that's something that a lot of people are quite excited about. Okay.
So if I could just add one more thing to your list of things you can do. Diet is a very large contributor as well, and that comes back into this issue of protein. I'm wondering if you could comment a little more specifically on where this demand for protein is coming from. Is it people switching their protein source? Is it adding protein to people who were before consuming livestock?
Let's see if I can pull up the slide. So, what you see, probably can't find the slide. I hate doing this. So this is the classic regression scatter plot of this is per capita income along the bottom and per capita fish supply. This is true for other protein sources as well. Is just empirically you see that as the income of a community goes up, they're eating more protein. It's tied into urbanization. So you're moving people, giving them more opportunities to have a more varied diet. And it's also, some of it is perception of, as they're, if they're in a subsistence economy, 30, 40, 50% of their equivalent net income is going to food, and they're buying as cheap a food as they can. As their income gets up, increases, they're demanding or wanting a more protein-rich diet. I don't know if that answers your question, but this is a pretty well-documented trend. You're seeing it a lot in, you can go back and look at it in Europe, in the US as we industrialize. You can see it definitely in China. The large increase in aquaculture, that huge increase in aquaculture that we saw on that red, green, yellow slide. That was a very deliberate policy within China to enhance aquaculture. And it was tied with the rising income of the middle class. Those two are very closely coupled. The rise of the economic growth within China at the per capita level is basically driving that increase in aquaculture.
I guess maybe what I'm wondering is if you overlaid on that graph per capita livestock supply and per capita protein supply from vegetables, what would it look like?
The livestock curve, the elasticity curve would look fairly similar. I'd have to dig out what the percentage increases are. I haven't seen a vegetable protein analysis. I've mostly seen it from a livestock, either livestock or food.
So I'm going to suggest we stop there. We thank Scott again, and we move